Hey, this is Julio.
Hey, this is Steve.
Before the podcast starts, we want to welcome and give you the opportunity to support our ministry by visiting our website at www.bridgemanlaredo.org. Scroll down to the bottom of any page and you'll find the PayPal donate button.
Bridge Ministries exists to share the glorious good news of Jesus Christ and to equip people to be transformed by the renewing of their minds. If you would like to help us in our mission of making affordable or free Bibles and Christian books available, and also to check out the orphanage that we support, visit our website.
But in your heart, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 16 through 17. This is Bridge Radio, episode number 23. And we're back, coming out of the great state of Texas, preaching the gospel fearlessly and faithfully. And I'm your host, Julio Omar Rodriguez, as always. And across from me, we got the boss.
How you doing, all? This is Steve Den Hartog. Appreciate you all taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, we're excited to do another podcast. We got a guest for you today, a brother in Christ who has influenced me a lot, and actually he's going to be speaking in Laredo's first apologetic conference that we're going to be holding at Texas A&M International University. And
you bet. Looking forward to that. Yeah,
for those who are in Texas, please feel free to make your way down here May 26th in Laredo, Texas. Again, it's going to be at Tammy U.
Tickets are a mere $5, right?
Yeah. And I believe after the 19th of May, they're going to shoot up to $10. So, yeah, get your tickets early. Like and share this podcast as well, and let people know that the conference is coming on. We actually, when we posted the banner, the flyer on social media, we actually got a lot of good feedback.
We did. Oh, absolutely. It's going to be good.
Yeah, a lot of people were excited. I heard that, well, at least someone commented that they were going to be buying tickets for their youth.
Right.
So the youth group. So yeah, we're definitely excited. Our speakers are going to be Steve Paulson, who's a friend of the ministry and a friend of our church. He's a physics teacher.
Yeah, locally here in Laredo.
And he loves apologetics. He loves theology. And we're having Eli Elia from Elia, however you always get it from his pronounce his last name. Just ask him. I always get his last name wrong, man. Anyway, he's from Long Island. He's going to be making a trip down for the conference. And we also got Matt Slick, founder of carm.org, and he's as well a debater as well. We had him on a podcast for the Five Solas. And our guest, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, but he's going to be with us as well. And we're just super excited to have the opportunity to share the gospel. And as I said in 1 Peter 3:16, all Christians should be able to worship the Lord God with their mind and give a reason for the hope that is in him. So, yes, May 26th.
May 26th from 8:30 till 3 o'clock.
Yeah, 8:30 to 3 o'clock. So it's going to be very fun. So before we bounce into the podcast, we got some free books by PNR. And we want to give an opportunity for people to get this book for free. If you drop us a 5-star review on the iTunes for this week, for this podcast, we will pick out somebody and ship them a free book by Richard B. Ramsey, The Certainty of the Faith, Apologetics in an Uncertain World. And we have people like John Frame, Rod Mays, and others really giving some good feedback with this book.
Yeah.
So, again, on the topic of apologetics, and so we want to just share that. Are you ready, Steve?
You betcha.
All right. So our guest today is a brother in Christ. Again, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, he's been a huge influence on me. I came across him through his debate against Matt Dillahunty on the soul. And I remember last year, I just reached out to him and asked him a couple of questions and invited him to be on the podcast. He's a fearless debater. He's always up for the challenge to debate atheists, even Christian brothers, in theology and the way we Christians should engage in apologetics. And I highly respect him. And again, he's been a blessing to me. I'd like to welcome Eric Hernandez back again on the program. How's it going, brother?
Good. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
You got it.
Yeah.
Appreciate you being on again today, Eric.
So, Eric, are you excited for the conference? It's going to be.
Oh, absolutely. I as much as I enjoy doing debates and things of that nature, I very much enjoy equipping the body. I'm a firm believer in, of course, what Scripture teaches as far as the fivefold ministry. And you know, every time I step behind the pulpit, I tell whoever I'm speaking to, if I have not equipped you by the end of this sermon or session or class, and I have not done my job, because our job as ministers is to equip, and if you're not equipping, you're not following the biblical mandate to do so.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah. And so have you ever done a conference like this before, man?
I've been part of conferences. I've taught apologetics within conferences, but not part of an official solely apologetic conference.
Okay.
I've done seminars myself. I've gone to churches and done like weekend seminars where it's like a Friday through Sunday class, and there's about 6 classes, and we go through the apologetics course that I developed.
Cool.
Great. Well, man, we got to get you to come down to do something like that here at Bridge.
Absolutely.
Just a little seminar.
Would love to.
Yeah. All right. So just for our listeners, for those who don't know Eric, just give a little testimony about yourself, and also what made you want to just do apologetics, engage in debate and study philosophy and this Christian apologetics deal that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I grew up in church. I could say I've been a Christian my whole life. I've never had any kind of testimony where I was a gangbanger or drugs or anything like that. And funny was growing up, I kind of figured if you want to be a minister, you have to have that kind of testimony. And I'm like, well, I don't want to get into drugs and become a gangbanger to have that testimony.
That's funny.
But to not minimize those testimonies. Also, getting older and going to college, I realized that when I looked in, like, for example, my youth group, I found a lot of emotionally driven Christianity, which was very flaky. It wouldn't last long. For example, we'd go to youth camp and everybody would come back fired up, and that would last for about 2 or 3 weeks. And what I came to see a pattern of is that it was that they associated their salvation or relationship with God with a mere emotion or feeling. So that's to say that when the feeling or emotion left in their mind, so did their salvation or their relationship. And thus you have young people answering the altar call every Sunday morning to be saved.
Right.
And for me, it was just something wasn't right. And it would seem that if God did exist, there was something to ground my relationship and salvation on much more than just my feelings and emotions.
Right.
And in this, I began to start to ask certain questions. As much as I appreciate the people God put in my life, one thing I've learned is that some people God puts in your life is not to necessarily show good examples, but to show what not to do. And I think that's just as valuable as showing you what to do. For example, I had a couple youth pastors who, when I would begin to ask certain questions, they would give me a cliche answer. And I'd say, okay, well, what about this? And what about that? And this wasn't me being rebellious, and it was often interpreted that way. It was just Eric, he's just being contradictory. He's just trying to, stir the pot. But I legitimately had these questions. And, at a few points I was told, look, just don't ask any more questions. Or you know what, Eric can no longer ask questions. Or, well, that's not important. Or, well, this and that. And it just it bothered me, because not only thinking to myself, if I as a Christian have these questions, then surely someone of another belief system or atheistic worldview would have these questions. And if my own youth pastor can't give me the answers, then what are we doing here? Or is this just a place for Christians to come and feel good? Well, then how are we to reach non-Christians? I mean, is that not the point, is to reach the non-believers? So that's always been my heart, is to reach not just the people who are already saved, which is why when I'm invited to do any kind of debates, if it's a public event where you're invited and you've got, hundreds of people attending and there's money put into it, put me with an atheist. As much as I enjoy theological discussions, I'd rather do that over the radio, over the air, or something like that. unless something else really important comes up. But for the most part, put me with an atheist because I want to reach those people. I want to reach the people, the unchurched, the people that aren't coming to church regularly. But to continue on with the response, my freshman year of college, and even before then, like I said, I began to ask questions. I was put in leadership positions at my church and at my high school. I was the president of Christ on campus, and we did a lot of great work there. But when I got to college, long story short, I took my first philosophy class. I was interested in psychology and philosophy, and honestly, I took philosophy because I needed to fill up an elective. It was required to take a certain amount of electives. So
Little
I figured
did you know.
I could, yeah, really. I figured, I could take this class. Maybe I can skip it a few times. It's nothing big. It'll be fine. And then I walk in, and just the questions that were thrown, not at me, but at the class in general. I really appreciate my first philosophy professor. He was very neutral in the sense that he wasn't trying to convert anybody or patronize anybody. He was very honest and reasonable, and at least I thought so. And I remember in my youth group, one of my youth leaders once said, if someone asks you to prove to them that God exists, all you have to tell them is to prove to me he doesn't. And I thought, wow, that's profound. And then when I got to my philosophy class, I remember one of the first week or so of the class, we talked about what's called the burden of proof. And what the burden of proof is essentially that if you make a truth claim, if you claim to know something or believe something, then it is up to you to bear the burden to prove that very claim.
Yeah.
And as an example, he said, so for example, if someone here believes in God and someone asks you to give them proof or evidence or reasons for why you believe that, which is what the Bible tells us to do, then you cannot respond by saying, well, prove to me God does not exist, because you are not bearing the burden of proof which you have put upon yourself. And I was just like, wow. I just felt like my entire one bullet in the chamber apologetic arsenal just collapsed.
Right.
And then I just was kind of more open-minded. So again, to be brief, because I could talk forever, you can ask my wife. After that first class, I was really, really intrigued. I was really, my gears were turning in my mind, and I wanted to take a second course in philosophy. When I was looking, I had a few of my peers tell me, whatever you do not take Professor Pena. And I don't mind mentioning his name because, as I'll share later, we actually did a debate, he and I. And they said, don't take his class because he's very antagonistic towards religion, especially Christianity. He's going to try to make you lose your faith and doubt your belief. And if you take his class, you could very well lose your Christianity. You can lose your faith in God. And I said, that's great. Sign me up. When do we start?
Sounds like
because
a challenge.
in my mind,
I would have loved to take that class.
mind, it was, if God exists, I've always believed that all truth comes from God, is grounded in God in one way or another.
Exactly.
So if God exists, and nothing that is true should contradict what God is, or says, or does, because all truth comes from God. So why should I be afraid to learn if what I learn could only strengthen my belief or faith in God? And if what I believe is not true, then I need to know this.
Right.
Yeah.
First day in class, he says something to the effect, we're going to be talking about a lot of controversial things. He said, we're even going to be talking about things that might contradict what you believe. But then he said something that really resonated with me. He said, however, I want you to know that when you come to a fork in the road where your beliefs do not line up with reality, and if you come to find that one of your beliefs are not true or false, then you have two options. You can ignore the truth and keep believing in a lie, or you can acknowledge reality, acknowledge the truth, and change your beliefs. However, he said, whatever you choose to do, just know that truth and reality does not care about your feelings. And to that I said yes and amen. And from there, I mean, as they say, that it's history from there. One more thing. I remember one class in particular, he comes in, and he would always sit down when he lectured. He would rarely stand up. He'd sit down on his desk, sometimes prop his feet up on his desk, and just kind of really, laid back kind of philosopher, very Rico Suave kind of guy, very smart, intelligent, brilliant guy. And he mimicked holding up a pill. And he said, suppose I have an antidepressant medication, which if I'm not mistaken, he took. I don't want to say for sure, so don't quote me on that. But and that's not to minimize anything of of who or what he is. I mean, I might take a medication for ADHD, but he held up a mimic holding up a pill, and he said, religion wants us to believe that there exists some kind of a soul. It's immaterial. And allegedly our emotions and our moods are in our soul. He said, however, if I can take this tiny little pill, which is physical, and it affect my mood, my emotions, my character, he goes, then how is it that something small and physical can affect something immaterial? He said, well, perhaps the answer is there is no soul, because when you look at our body, all you see is hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, all the elements, and it's all physical, up and down, and there is no soul. There is no afterlife. And when he said that, it really, really struck me, because first of all, I had never heard anyone question the belief in the soul. I thought that was just a given,
Right.
Maybe me being naive. And when he said that, not only had I never heard anyone question the soul, I had never heard anyone defend or give an argument for the soul. And it was because of that I really began to think, okay, here are some possible defeaters to what I believe. Where do I go from here? And again, for the sake of brevity, I'd say now the topic of the soul, consciousness, free will is probably one of my more well-suited areas of apologetics that I've really studied and dug my feet into with men like J.P. Moreland, even Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, and things like that, where, as you said earlier in the show, you saw one of my debates was with Matt Dillahunty, and it was on the issue of whether or not the soul exists.
And so now we're years later from that, and so now how many atheists have you debated, or how many debates have you engaged in total?
Formal or informal?
Both, all.
Oh, gosh, I have no idea. I've lost count. And I guess public debates, quite a few. At least a dozen, and these are, either at universities or in churches or in any kind of public arena where it's formal, up on stage. Informal, I have no idea. But just to make the point, to anyone listening, any aspiring apologist, I would definitely say, don't wake up in the morning and look for a debate.
Right.
Now, if you want to. Now, here's what I did in the beginning. I would, in a sense, wake up in the morning and I would see certain comments on Facebook or go into certain atheist pages, and I would just like to, for lack of a better word, practice or try out what I had learned or what I believed. And I wouldn't do it in a sense to, quote, win an argument and as if I have a chalkboard behind my desk and I, tally up every time I win. It was more to see what are the objections to this? What would an atheist say to this?
What do they believe?
I would hear an argument by Willem Lane Craig, and I was like, this is incredible. How would you defeat this argument? I would present it to an atheist. And to my dismay, I wouldn't hear any real responses. I would hear just something like, well, you just believe in a magical man in the sky. And I said, okay, but what do you say about this right here, what I just said? Well, you're just brainwashed by your religion. Okay, I still want an answer to this. And it was just kind of repetitive. So at this point, I don't even really engage much on Facebook with many atheists. But I say that to say, as Christians, we want to, as the greatest commandment says, love God with all our hearts, our minds, our soul, and our strength. That word mind literally means your intellect, your faculty of understanding. So if we're to fulfill the greatest commandment that Christ said was the greatest commandment, part of that commandment is to love God with your mind, and that includes digging deep, learning, educating yourself, expanding your horizon when it comes to your knowledge of God. And as I've heard J.P. Moreland say, whether you're lifting up a book to read or lifting up your hands, these are both signs of worshiping and loving God with all your being. So in these instances, we want to reflect this commandment that Christ gave us, which he himself also fulfilled.
Yeah. Amen. Sorry, guys, who are listening on the podcast. I had a phone call. You're probably going to hear some beeps on the podcast. I had a phone call coming in. But no. That's good stuff. No, I just wanted to point out, because I mean, little did you know, right, that philosophy class that God was going to use that as a means to engage in debate, and also too, you're writing a book right now. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that book?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, trying to be brief for the sake of time. To go back to the Testament really quick, what really got me into this was in that first class of philosophy, I remember there was my philosophy professor said, once a month we do a round table discussion. And what it is, it's after hours where you come to this event. We have about 4 people up on the stage, and we discuss a certain topic. And he said, if you come to this and do a paper on it, you get extra credit. Okay. Well, being a freshman at that time, I needed the extra credit. And it happened to be a discussion on religion. So, again, long story short, there's 4 people up there. It was a Christian, a Buddhist, a Muslim, and then an atheist. And they would ask certain questions. At the end of the day, I found that every time a question was given, the Christian would give a cliche Christian answer. And then when it got to the atheist, which was going to be my second professor that I was going to take, when it got to his answer, he would just pretty much make the Christian look stupid. And I thought to myself, this Christian is not doing a good job. And again, and this wasn't a Christian apologist. It was, a retired 40-year missionary. Right. And so, I don't blame the person, but at the same time, I thought to myself, someone has to do something. And I remember my friend telling me, well, why don't you do it? And I said, well, time out. That's not what I meant. And my friend said, well, do you think you could do better than this Christian did? I said, yeah, I think so. And they're like, okay, well, then why not? That began my studies in apologetics. And a few years later, I ended up debating my former professor one-on-one. I don't know if you've seen the movie God's Not Dead. Nothing like that. Not too fond of the movie either. Anyways, that kind of began my wheels turning. Now, as I began to engage with atheists, get into the book, as I said earlier, I would find every time I would talk with an atheist, there was really no substance in their responses or their arguments. And going back to the burden of proof, as I mentioned earlier, the burden of proof is not just for people who claim positive beliefs, but it's also for people who claim negative beliefs. And by that I mean, I do not believe in X, or I believe X does not exist. So if I say I believe X, I am making a truth claim. And if I say I believe that X does not exist, I am still making a truth claim, which means I equally bear a burden of proof. So if the atheist says God does not exist and he believes that, then he still has to bear a burden of proof. So what I found in my engagements, rather than take the immediate defensive side and begin to give arguments and defend my faith or beliefs, I would kind of turn the tables for a second and say, well, let me ask you, why are you an atheist? And 9 times out of 9, I would get some answer like, well, because religion is full of fairy tales, or et cetera, et cetera. And I would say, okay, well, time out. Let's pretend. Let's take one of their responses. Like one person said, well, I believe in science. I said, okay, well, so do I, but I'm a Christian, so I don't see how that proves God does not exist. Well, religion just wants you for your money. I said, okay, that may be true in some instances for some religions, but how does that prove, therefore, God does not exist? Well, I believe in science and psychology and history, and I said, well, time out. Now you're just naming disciplines. I still want a positive reason for why you believe God does not exist. And again, rarely do I get answers. Instead, I would just get attacks on the Bible, on Christianity, on my character, et cetera, et cetera. So when in seeing this pattern, I thought to myself, a lot of atheists that I've engaged with really don't know the arguments for God's existence, and they don't have any reasons for why they believe what they do. While most apologetic books are a defense of Christianity and theism, I thought to myself, I'd love to write a book, not necessarily per se defending Christianity or God, but taking a backdoor approach and saying, let's look at atheism. If, as an atheist, when we look at what's called epistemology, which is a field of philosophy, it's how we come to beliefs and how we know things. There are things what are called epistemic chains. So sometimes belief A implies B, and if you believe A, then you have to believe B, and then B implies C. And so if you believe A, you have to believe both B and C because that's what it logically leads to. Right. So I thought to myself, well, if atheism is true, then this would imply B and C. But then in epistemology, you also have a really interesting formula, if you will, that shows that if A implies B, But if B is not true, then it would follow that A cannot be true either. So to give a quick example, let's suppose that I believe, let's say today is Friday, and I believe that everything that people say on Friday is a lie. So I go to work and someone says, "Hey, how's it going, Eric? You look great today." And I think, well, today's Friday, so they must be lying. But then the next person says, "Hey, Eric, how's it going? Why do you look so glum? Cheer up. After all, it's Friday." Now, when that person said it's Friday, if my belief is everything people say on Friday is a lie, and this person just told me it's Friday, well, I know that's true, which means my beliefs now have conflict. It becomes self-defeating, so I have to give up or change my belief.
Yeah.
That being said, my book is a look at atheism and saying, okay, if atheism is true, here's what we have. All you have is naturalistic evolution, physical things interacting with physical things. What do you get? One of my arguments is for the argument on consciousness, and it's basically in a nutshell that if consciousness exists, then it's not physical. Well, I've used this argument with atheists, and I start by saying, you're an atheist, correct? They say yes. Okay. So would you agree that if there is no God and atheism is true, then we have no reason to believe that non-physical things exist? You know, like fairies, angels, anything immaterial, nothing like that. They say, right. All physical, yes, okay. All the way down, just purely physical things. I said, okay, so if atheism is true, then only physical things should exist. However, if I can show that something non-physical exists, would it not therefore prove that atheism cannot be true? And they say, yeah, sure. But what exists is not physical. I say, oh, well glad you asked. And just to not get into it, basically I demonstrate how if consciousness exists, it's not physical because the properties of the mind are not the same as the properties of the brain. That is to say, there are things true of my mind that are not true of my brain. For example, my thoughts, which are in my mind, can be true or false, but no region of my brain is true or false. My thought that it's a beautiful day does not weigh 3 pounds, but my brain weighs 3 pounds. So it would follow that if my mind is not my brain and it's not physical, then consciousness, if it exists, which it obviously does, is not physical. And if you now have the existence of something non-physical, then it would follow that atheism cannot be true.
Yeah. No, this good line of logic there.
It is. That was good.
Yeah. No, I think no, I was following you completely, but I think this is like the whole. Well, Steve has asked me multiple times, like, what is consciousness or what is the essence of existence, and like these huge questions, like. I mean, they'll take you for a whirlwind, man. Like, when you just begin to truly think about it, it'll really challenge.
And they're solid questions that we as Christians should have an answer to.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
That brings me to another point that I wanted, before we dive into one of the arguments that I wanted to present for our listeners today, is that I think atheism has really done a good job in the sense of really taking this notion that philosophy belongs to atheism, science belongs to atheism, like logic belongs to atheism, reason belongs to, like, I mean, you even have their rally, which is called the Reason Rally,
right?
And so they have this like very exclusive claim, like it's only us, and we're anti-religious because, I mean, even whenever it comes down to them, religion is the term religious is a very loaded term, and I mean everybody's religious in essence. I mean, I was listening to David Silverman. I was talking to Eric about this yesterday before the podcast. I was saying that I was listening to David Silverman and another atheist, and they were going back and forth talking about what different thoughts atheism have, and they were mentioning something called firebrand atheism and another sect of atheism that is very spiritual and stuff, and how they didn't disagree with them. And I thought, look at these guys and their denominations.
Exactly.
I mean, they have their
a belief system.
Yeah, they have their Genesis, which is the origins of species. I mean, I've always said we should create a book, or the Atheist Bible, that had, Lawrence Krauss's A Universe from Nothing and the origins of species. But I mean, they have their prophets, they have their dogma, they have their belief. But no, Eric, I wanted you to to just talk about that for a minute, because that's really going to hit into the topic that we're going to be speaking today of the whole concept of metaphysics and science, that, Christianity can't really reconcile any sort of science or philosophy, and science and philosophy belong to atheism. And I would like for you to talk for that for a moment for our listeners, and just before we jump into one of the arguments that we're going to be discussing today for the existence of God.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So one piece of advice for anyone listening is that whenever atheists throw these, quote, objections at you, I think the first thing to do would be to allow them to bear the burden of proof. So, for example, as you said, if someone says, well, Christianity can't reconcile science, it belongs to atheism. Mm-hmm. Well, no, that's not an argument. That's a statement. That's an assertion. So if someone were to tell me that, or if someone were to say that in general, what I find is Christians are quick to jump on the bandwagon and begin to give a response, where my tactic is to say, okay, why, as Greg Kokel in his book Tactics says, how did you come to that conclusion? Or I would say, okay, could you elaborate why that's the case? Most atheists are scientists or something like that. Or most scientists are atheists or whatever the case. Yeah. I say, okay, well, no, that's not necessarily the case. It's about 50-50. There might be a little bit more. Yeah. But I would say, go on, like go ahead and finish the argument, because so far I've just heard an assertion and an argument. Mm-hmm. What you said, interestingly, was that they have these reason rallies, right? Mm-hmm. And in my book, that's the very thing I'm trying to get at, is to show that a lot of things that atheists want to claim hold to are not possible in their own worldview. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in one of my chapters of my book, I talk about the issue of free will. And one very popular title that atheists like to attribute to themselves, they call themselves the free thinkers, which I find very ironic. And what they mean by that is they mean that they are not brainwashed by religion and they are free to think for themselves. Mm-hmm. But in my book, I argue that if there is no soul and if you're all just a physical machine, mm-hmm. then there can be no free will. Yeah. And I'll set aside the unpacking of that argument. But towards the end of the chapter, I basically say, so if you're an atheist and you deny the soul, then the last thing you can literally call yourself is a free thinker, because none of your thoughts could ever be free on atheism. Mm-hmm. So the very irony behind them claiming reason and freedom is that on atheism there can be no rationality and there can be no freedom. And thus, if you're an atheist, you cannot be a free thinker, nor by default can you be reasonable if there is no God. Which is why my book title is...
It's a great title. It's funny.
It's called Why I'm Not an Atheist. And the subtitle is An Analysis of the Self-Defeating, Irrational, Philosophically Inconsistent, Logically Incoherent, Unjustified Atheistic Worldview.
That's like a Puritan book title.
It is. That's what I thought. Yes.
That's like Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah, that's like John Owen, or yeah, that's funny. No, I when I first heard the title a year ago, I was like, that's an inflammatory title that's going to stir some controversy on the opposite end.
Yeah, man. They're like one atheist said, those are fighting words. David Smalley invited me on his show because he really liked the title, and he invited me to talk about my book. And he said, you can come on my show. You attack atheism, and I'll defend it. You know, usually I attack the Christian, they defend their beliefs. Mm-hmm. You come on my show, talk about your book, attack atheism, I'll defend it. Needless to say, the show was taken down about a month later. I won't say why, but
okay.
But we agreed to that if I did the show, he would give me a copy of the show. So we now have it up on our website, on our YouTube channel, and I encourage everybody to listen to it. It's called Texas Preacher versus David Smalley. It's what he called me, Texas Preacher.
Texas Preacher.
Yeah. And it was a great show. I was able to talk about the book and some of the things I discussed that we briefly discussed just now. So
it was great. I'll link up for the listeners that podcast or your debate with Somali. No, I think the one thing with Eric that I really appreciated is he's very quick on his responses. Eric, you respond very quick and very sound and logical, and I could just tell where it's quite intimidating for the atheists. And this is another thing too, is that I think not a lot of atheists have encountered true Christians who actually study science and philosophy and who engage in debate. And when they do, it kind of takes them like by surprise, like, oh snap, I've never really encountered this before. I don't know how to handle this. Me and Steve were actually watching the Sam Harris and William Lane Craig debate, and even Sam Harris is like, William Lane Craig is the guy that strikes fear into my colleagues. And then you even have as well Christopher Hitchens, who before the debate with William Lane Craig said that he had a lot of his colleagues or the unbelieving community come up to him and say, don't make us look dumb, like represent us well. And so whenever just because I say this because even in high school I was just so I had the majority of my friends were atheists, and so they would make fun of me because I was a Christian or a theist. I didn't really know how to defend my faith, but when encountering some of these heavy hitting philosophers like John Frame and William Lane Craig, and Alvin Platinga's another one who's just like incredible. J.P. Moreland. I mean, you start listening to these guys, John Lennox, who we saw, me and Eric went to go see John Lennox at in Houston, and you see these guys and they're brilliant minds, man. I mean, brilliant.
Absolutely.
And they have sound, logical, reasoned answers. And so this is another thing that I want to say is I remember for a while I used to think I kind of was brainwashed in the sense that I thought, maybe believing God is this just crazy delusion and I'm just dumb, and that's been the case for many people who have left the faith or kind of struggling at this moment. But going back to also that your chapter on free will, on the whole free thinking stuff, I'm looking at, and I'll tag this on the description below. But I mean, you even have Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins in a video saying that free will is an illusion. I guess if you could talk about that for a minute. I mean, what are the ramifications for that, especially when it comes to like rape? I mean, how are you gonna, as an atheist? I mean, how can you punish that? Like, how do you? It's just kind of man's urges, and it's determined. I mean, he's just merely going off of his emotions and feelings and his brain fizz. Can you talk about that for a moment, Eric, before finally we jump into the chapter?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So usually, and so funny, I was at a Christmas party one time, and I was, for some reason, everybody always wants to talk to me about God and apologetics, right? Joking, of course. It just always comes up, and of course, I'm sure I'm the one that brings it up. And I don't know how it started, but I was discussing with this guy who was professing atheist, and I think he actually brought up, he said he was studying some areas, and he said one of the areas he was studying was free will. And he says that he's come to the belief that there is no free will. And I said, that's interesting. I said, and how'd you come to that conclusion? He goes, well, I studied, I did this, and looked at this, and neuroscience, et cetera. I said, so you did that all on your own? He said, yeah, absolutely. You studied that by yourself. Yeah. No one forced you. I said, yeah. I said, so you believe there's no free will? He said, right. I said, did you freely come to believe that? And he paused for a second.
Uh-oh.
And I said, yeah, so it sounds to me like you're telling me that you freely came to believe in the conclusion that there is no free will. Is that right? He said, well, yeah, no, and he just paused. And I said, let me ask you another question, which is what you just brought up. I said, if there is no free will, I said, why should we punish people who commit crimes?
Yeah.
If they were just determined to do it? I said, here's an illustration really quick that I use in my book. Suppose I murder someone with a gun. Now, technically speaking, the bullet penetrated the guy's heart and killed him. But we don't blame the bullet. Why? Because we assume that the bullet was not the first mover of its actions. Well, no, it was shot by the gun. Okay, why don't we blame the gun? Well, because the gun itself wasn't also a first mover. It was caused by the hitting of the hammer. Okay, and what made the hammer fire? Well, by the pulling of the trigger. Okay, what made the trigger pull? My finger. Okay, time out. Now, if atheism is true, then you have what's called the law of causal closure, which is to say that every physical event must have a physical cause. Well, if the bullet was shot by the gun was shot by the pulling of the trigger, then what caused me? Well, if there is no soul and you cannot transcend the physical, then you have to keep going down like a line of dominoes. And if there is no free will on atheism, then if you don't stop and blame the bullet or the gun, then you cannot blame the murderer, because he too was just another domino in a line of events, in a chain of events. So you have to keep going back, which is to say that we cannot blame murderers, rapists, or criminals for what they do, if they are just like a bullet and gun, purely physical objects acting and reacting to the laws of physics and chemistry, and it's just a line of dominoes going down all the way.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a solid argument right there.
Very good point.
Yeah, very good. And this is another thing that I want to say. Not all atheists are determinists. And that's what we're talking about here. And that is what Lawrence Krauss and Dawkins, I believe Dennett too. I think Sam Harris as well, if I'm not mistaken, they're determinists. So they do believe free will is an illusion. But I know someone like...
Yeah, and if I can say one more thing to that, actually. Well, the also funny thing too is that if you cannot take rational responsibility for anything you believe, and if all your beliefs are determined, then you have no way of knowing whether or not your beliefs are true. So, for example, let's say an atheist says, well, I can test my beliefs. I said, okay, please elaborate. I can go into the laboratory and I can test my beliefs, and then after the conclusion of my test, I can find whether or not my beliefs are true. I said, well, time out. You're just pushing back the goalposts. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if all your beliefs are determined, then it would equally follow that your very belief that your beliefs are true is equally something you were determined to do and believe, and you're back to the same problem. So you have no way of knowing which of your beliefs are true. And if you cannot trust that any of your beliefs are true, then why should I believe you when your beliefs tells me that there is no God?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a sound argument, and you got to deal with that. The atheist is going to have to deal with that. So, all right, so let's jump into chapter 5. As we're preparing for this podcast, Eric sent me like a ton of chapters of his book. I think I have the whole book on PDF by email. Yeah, and I would love to go through all of them. I actually didn't read all of them, but I did read chapter 5, which is the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and it's chapter 5 in the beginning. And I guess whenever this book is finally published, man, we'll be doing a whole podcast, or maybe we'll do like a series or something on it. I would really like to do it. But let's go into the so me and Eric affirm first and foremost that there is a God, and so like Eric was saying at the beginning with his philosophy professor, that we have the burden of proof. And so today what we're going to be doing is providing an argument, or Eric is, that is, in the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And so where should we begin with this, Eric, with this argument?
Yeah, well, first I'd say, so that I'm still writing the book, so everyone listening, please keep in your prayers. Lots of stuff has come up recently that has kind of slowed down the progress, but slowly but surely I'm pushing through. I'm writing, so please keep in your prayers. So as I said earlier, anyone who makes a truth claim bears a burden of proof. Whether you say there is a God, you bear a burden. If you say there is no God, you bear a burden. One of my favorite arguments for the existence of God is, as you said, known as the Kalam Cosmological Argument, or you can just call it the Cosmological Argument for short. And it's a very simple argument. You can give it to an atheist in 30 seconds or less. And I love to do this when I'm out, or I like to imagine. I believe it was Greg Coco said, imagine you're in a taxi cab, or maybe Mike Licona. Imagine you're in a taxi cab and you have about a few minutes with someone in a taxi cab. They're an atheist. What would you give them? So the Kalam Cosmological Argument is 3 premises. In other words, it's 3 sentences, two premises that lead to a conclusion. It's very simple. Premise 1 is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, in talking with an atheist, I usually like to walk them through it and say, would you agree that everything that begins to exist has a cause? And 9 times out of 10, yeah, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay, good. Because if you deny that, then you are tearing down the very what drives science is looking for causes. So everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay, premise 2, the universe began to exist. Now, based on modern cosmology, we know this to be the case. Now, call it what you want. To the Christian listeners, don't get bogged up on what they call it. They call it the Big Bang, whatever you want to call it, the universe began to exist. And they say, yes, okay. Then the conclusion is that, therefore, the universe had a cause. Now, with that being said, let's unpack what the attributes of this cause must have been. Now, at the inception of the universe, that is to say, the beginning of the universe, you had 3 things come into existence that did not exist without the universe's beginning, and that was time, space, and matter. And to put it differently, based on modern science, we know that time, space, and matter had a beginning. Now, by default, whatever causes time, space, and matter has to be outside of time, space, and matter, which is to say that the cause of the beginning of the universe was necessarily timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. So automatically we have the existence of a first cause that is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Now let's push it a little bit further. Now, if this entity, this being, created something out of absolutely nothing, then you have a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, unimaginably powerful being. Let's go another step. This being had to make a decision to create something out of nothing, and we know that something personal makes decisions. So now you have a timeless, spaceless, unimaginably powerful, immaterial, personal being, which is exactly the attributes that we ascribe to God. So if the universe had a beginning, it would follow that therefore God exists.
Yeah. On the beginning, this is something that I found very, very interesting. I've always known it. It wasn't until this chapter that it kind of cleared up some things. But you said that your professor, and this just goes along with the argument, guys. But he told you you're rather going to ignore the truth, right? Or you're going to acknowledge reality. And you wrote here in your book, do you mind if I read it?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. But you said, for a long time, atheists believed the universe was eternal and stretched indefinitely into the past. Let me see here. And so we have Fred Hoyle, who was an astronomer, and he was the one, I believe, who coined the term Big Bang. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And then you have the John Maddox, and Maddox expressed, this is in your book, Maddox expressed that the scientific community should resist this Big Bang theory and was concerned that it gave too much leverage to the people who believed in creation in the Bible. Can you flesh that out, and how originally it was a Catholic priest who first sort of coined this idea of the Big Bang, or that there was a beginning, and that you have atheists here actually ignoring the truth of reality, that the universe did have a cause, or it had a beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something I got from John Lennox that he often gives in his lectures, and the sense of it behind this is basically, you hear a lot of times that atheists say that religion is against science, or more specifically, Christianity is against science, and they like to use examples of the Galileo thing, where they, there was a big issue, and it was religion versus science, when it really wasn't religion versus science. It was two scientific theories competing against each other, and the church held to a certain specific scientific theory that this new guy here was going against. Setting that aside, when you look at history, you don't find Christianity being against science, and I would even say to this day, you don't find Christianity being against science. Sure, there might be some people who are, for lack of a better word, ignorant and don't know what they're talking about, which we really shouldn't give those people platforms.
Yeah.
But we look and we see that, first of all, science flourished in a certain part of the world where there was a fundamental belief that the universe is rationally intelligible, which is to say that we as human beings with intellectual, rational minds are capable of decoding the rationality behind the universe. Well, what drove this belief that there was rationality to be found in the universe? It was the belief that there was a God, a rational, infinite mind, God, who created the universe. Yeah. So what's interesting is when you look in the history of science, you find in certain parts of the world, like in the East, science was not flourishing. It was in the West, where there was this fundamental belief that God created the universe. And it was because of that, based on that belief, that science began and flourished, because you had believers in God, Christians, looking for patterns, rationality, information within the universe, because they believed the universe came from a mind. Yeah. Now, this is not something that I necessarily read in a Christian book. This is something even men like Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins would admit to. Yeah. Now, of course, someone like Lawrence Krauss would say, oh, yeah, okay, yes, sure, Christians, yes, the believers in God, they started science, and he says, okay, thank you, now get out of our way. Yeah. But he misses the very point that it was because of this belief that this flourishing of science came from. Now, to what you were saying is that it was the belief that there was a God, and more specifically, it was showing that these Christians were the ones that began to push and give rise to science. And the irony is that it was not the Christians who were fighting against modern findings in science. It was the atheists who did not want to believe this, because they said, no, look, if we believe that the universe had a beginning, then we're going to give way too much credit to in the beginning.
Yeah.
So there were so many theories, and to this day there are still theories that, and there are still atheists who believe, no, the universe is past eternal. The universe has always existed.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big reasons they want to push this is because it avoids the conclusion the universe had a beginning, because if the universe had a beginning, then God exists.
Yeah.
Now, what would be a response to someone who says, no, the universe is past eternal? Well, there's a few. First, with science, modern cosmology shows us that there are certain principles and laws of nature that would lead us to the conclusion that the universe cannot be eternal. One is entropy, the law of thermodynamics. Well, the law of thermodynamics says that energy is constantly being used up. And the universe has a certain limited amount of usable energy. For example, if you put gas in your car and the next day you see that it's still pretty full, then you know that no one overnight got inside and drove it around town, unless, of course, they put gas in it. But then, that'd be a different story. Point being, though, if you put gas in your car and it still has it, no one's touched it, then you know that it hasn't been driving around your whole block. Yeah. Why? Because it has a limited amount of energy. By the same token, the universe is still running. It's still spinning. As someone said, if the universe is winding down, then someone must have wound it up. Now, if the universe was past eternal, that is to say, if it's always been here, then it would have ran out of energy long before today. Well, we're here today, and it has not run out of energy, usable energy, which would follow that, therefore, it is not past eternal. It had a beginning. Yeah. Philosophically speaking, you cannot cross infinity. What does that mean? Suppose I asked you to count to infinity. How long would it take you to count and to reach infinity? Well, you could never reach it. Why? Because you cannot cross infinity. You can't go from one and then keep counting, because you'll never reach infinity. So it's a potential infinity. It's not an actual infinity. Well, by the same token, why are we here today? Well, because yesterday ended. Okay. Well, why did yesterday end? Because the day before that ended. Well, if you keep going back and there is no beginning, then you'll never reach today. Yeah. Why? Because think of a line of dominoes. Why did the 100th domino fall? Because domino 99 fell. Yeah. And if you keep going back and you never have a first domino that fell, you'll never have the 100th domino falling. Yeah. But if the 100th domino fell, then you know somewhere down the line there was a first domino to fall. J.P. Moreland gives a great illustration of saying that if the universe is past eternal, then it would be like trying to jump out of a well that is infinitely tall. You can't do it. But even worse, if it's past eternal with no beginning, then it's like trying to jump out of an infinitely tall well that has no bottom. Not only could you never do it, you can't even get started to try. Yeah.
This is another thing, coming back to the whole concept of some atheists, saying that the universe is eternal. And they always like to, for us, they like to use that infinite regress argument for us when it comes to the existence of God. And I like Rush Dooney's inescapable concept that's defined as not whether but which. And it's a really good tool to use during debates, I have found, or just engagement with atheists. But it's not that I believe in something eternal, but it's whether it's not whether I believe in something is eternal, but which is eternal. And so what that means is of course, somebody has to believe that something is eternal, infinite, and you'll find the atheists as well believing in these things, but attributing eternality to rather matter or energy or the universe, and they can't really evade this question. And then this I don't know if you had anything to say on that, but this also points me to also them redefining, as I've read Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing, but then he goes on to redefine nothing as something. And this is something that you address in Chapter 5 as well. And I would like for you to talk about that for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. Some atheists want to deny the beginning of the universe or want to deny how the universe came into existence. And as you said, some atheists will argue that the universe just popped out of nothing and as Lawrence Krauss does, they want to redefine what nothing means. And there was something else. What you ask before that?
The eternal nature that some atheists believe in, that it's not whether I believe in something eternal, but was it not whether, but which is eternal? Yeah, it's not whether I believe something is eternal, but which is eternal. Everybody's going to have to believe in something that's eternal, or attribute it attributes or characteristics of God to something. And yeah, I wanted you to talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. So this goes into my chapter 4, which is before the Kalam, which is the argument from contingency. And in a nutshell, it's basically that everything that exists is going to be either necessary or contingent. What that means is that, for example, let's take truth claims or just facts of reality. So 2 + 2 = 4. That's a necessary truth, which means whether I go to Africa or to the other part of the universe, 2 + 2 is going to equal 4 no matter where I'm at, because that is a necessary truth. Which means it's not as if one day in 100 years scientists will discover that 2 + 2 does not equal 4, or that 1,000 years ago 2 + 2 did not equal 4. This is a necessary truth. Contrast that with something contingent. Something contingent is a truth or fact of reality that did not have to be true necessarily. So, for example, my existence. I exist, but I am not necessary, which means my parents could have consummated on a different day of the week or something of that nature, and I would not have existed, which means we could imagine a world in which I don't exist, but we cannot imagine a world in which 2 + 2 does not equal 4, because that is a necessary truth. Now, that being said, if the universe is contingent, then you have to explain that by something else. And if you just keep going to contingent things, you have not finished your explanation until you reach something necessary. So as you said, God would be the necessary being which gave existence to everything else. And if this being is necessary, then this being is also eternal. So you have a necessary eternal being. Now, if the atheist wants to say that the universe is eternal or necessary, you would have to say, okay, why do you think that? Because surely there's nothing necessary about there are, let's say, there's thousands of blades of grasses in my front yard, but there could have been one less. So there's nothing necessary about that, which is to say there is nothing necessary about this universe existing. And if it's not necessary, then it could not have been eternal. And you can add that and stack that on top of the arguments I have already given for why the universe had a beginning and could not have been infinite and eternal into the past.
Yeah. Good stuff. And also, too, you in chapter 5, you mentioned that some atheists will try to evade the question and say, well, there's a multi-universe theory, and that's kind of like our answer to it. How is that fallacious reasoning as an objection to the cosmological argument?
Yeah, and before I go there, because you mentioned also coming from nothing.
Oh, yeah. So please ask. Yeah, that one's good.
So Lawrence Krauss writes an entire book on how the universe came from nothing. But then when you ask him what nothing is, he defines it. He says, he literally says nothing has weight, it has mass. And then you're like, well, time out. You're not talking about nothing. You're talking about something.
Yeah.
And even men like Matt Dillahunty say, well, we don't know what nothing is because we've never seen it. And I'm thinking to myself, how do you not know what nothing is, and why do you have to see it? Nothing is the absence of everything.
Yeah.
So it would be like saying, I've heard Craig use this example, it'd be like someone saying, hey, so what did you have for lunch? And someone says, oh, I had nothing for lunch. And they say, oh, that's awesome. What did it taste like? Was it good? Did it fill you up? You're like, no, I did not have anything for lunch.
Yeah.
Right. I had no thing, the absence of everything.
Yeah.
So to say that the universe came from nothing and then to redefine nothing as something, you are not only being logically contradictory, but now you're just reaching far into who knows what kind of la-la land to try to avoid the conclusion that God exists, which is special pleading, it's ad hoc, it's question begging, and it's logically fallacious.
Yeah. And there's another thing before we go into the last point that I was talking to, the multiverse theory. There's something else in the whole concept of quantum mechanics that Lawrence talks about, and he's talking about that virtual particles can pop into existence uncaused and out of nothing. And so if you could talk about that for a moment, because that could definitely take a Christian off guard, but there's also a way in which they define this sort of quantum mechanic process of particles coming in and out. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Absolutely. So there's like a kind of like ongoing joke in apologetics that anytime an atheist doesn't know how to answer something, they just say quantum mechanics. They just pull that card, quantum mechanic card.
Yeah,
like it's their ace in the hole. It's a joker. They just win automatically.
Right. And I've read, I've read the book A Universe from Nothing, and it was quite a couple of years back before we jump into you answering this. Sorry to interrupt, but I remember even like I think I was just in the preface of it, and I was already like, really? Like he's literally just redefining what nothing is. Like, just interesting, man. And again, this goes back to, Christians need to be aware to discern this sort of stuff. They're redefining terms.
Yeah, absolutely. A few things I'll say, which you can, if you have ears and eyes to detect this, which is what the Bible tells us to do, you can easily discern, like you said, what's going on, what kind of bait and switch is happening. So, for example, atheists will say, well, there are quantum particles that pop in and out of existence for no reason at all. And if that could happen, then the universe can pop into existence for no reason at all. And I say, well, time out. First of all, what they're saying essentially is these mysterious things happen and we don't know how or why. But no, that's not the argument. The argument is not saying we don't know why the universe came into existence. That's a teleological a reason, a goal, a purpose. Well, that's not what the argument is getting at. The argument is simply getting at the universe had a beginning and therefore had a cause. So the first response would be, even if we don't know why or how these particles pop into existence, our ignorance of how does not conclude that therefore no cause. It simply says we don't know the cause. So arguing from ignorance is not an argument at all. For example, I could say, I could pick my phone up and call my sister in Austin and I'm in Houston, or someone across the world. I may not know how it works or why it works, but I know that it works. So saying we don't know how or why these particles pop into existence and out for no reason, we don't know, is not to say that there is not a cause behind it. So that's the first thing to say. Secondly, they would say, well, sometimes they'll say, well, it pops out of this nothing. Okay, well, what is this nothing? Oh, it's a quantum fluctuation of energy. Okay, so time out. This nothing is actually a vacuum of fluctuating energy. Yes. Okay, then how is that nothing? Well, then you're just going to have to redefine nothing. Well, then if we're going to redefine terms, then, I mean, gosh, if we're going to reinterpret and redefine every word, then when they tell me there is no God because of X, I say, oh, I did not know you were such a devoted Christian. What church do you go to? And they say, no, I'm an atheist. Oh, so you really believe in God and you love him with all your heart? No, I'm an atheist. Right. Point is, if I just redefine and reinterpret everything you say to mean something else, we can't go anywhere. There's no discussion. One interesting thing is that there was another physicist, because that's what Lawrence Krauss is, a physicist. One of his colleagues actually mocks him and says, like, dude, what are you talking about? And what he gives this analogy of these quantum particles popping in and out of existence. He says, that's like saying I have 5 fingers, and when I make a fist, when I close them, I can make a fist, and when I open them, it's no longer a fist. So I have, quote, a fist popping in and out of existence. But first of all, that's not out of nothing, and all that is a different reaction.
Wow.
So you can't say that the universe could have came from a fluctuating sea of energy. Well, first of all, you're not starting with nothing. You're starting with something. And even if we can't explain how or why, it does not follow that it did not have a cause. So if you want nothing, you have to start with literally the absence of everything. And I heard a joke once of these atheists, they come to God, or these scientists come to God and say, we don't need you. We can create life ourselves. And God says, oh, that's fascinating. Let me see how you do it. They say, sure. And they reach down to the ground and they grab some dirt and they start molding it. And God says, wait, time out. Get your own dirt. In other words, they're not starting with nothing. They're starting with something already there. And if you're starting with something already there, then the universe had to come from something and had a cause.
Yes. Good stuff, man. Okay, so let's tackle that multiverse theory, which is literally just moving the goalpost.
Absolutely. So what some atheists will do is they'll say, well, the universe so I was on Facebook one time, and I watched this video, and it was a slightly viral video, and it was a video of an alleged leaked FBI footage of an alien interview, and big stuff. And I don't believe in aliens. I've got my own reasons for that. I mean, this life is so improbable.
Yeah,
in fact, the SETI project, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, was actually founded by an atheist, and I know Carl Sagan ran it. And the universe was funding millions of dollars into finding intelligent life in our universe.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, not too long ago, relatively speaking, the government stopped funding this project. Why? Because when science began to show us how improbable and how hard it is for life to exist, they literally said it's virtually impossible, first of all, that life exists at all. So something had to happen here. And if something had to happen here, then we have no reason to believe it happened anywhere else. So the government actually stopped funding that project. Now, going back to this Facebook video, it was this alien allegedly. They were interviewing this alien that they, quote, captured Area 51 or whatever. And I pushed play because a few people sent it to me. And, of course, the alien starts, the guy, the FBI alleged agent, starts asking questions about just, truth, reality, and stuff like that. And he tells the alien, well, you're much more advanced than us. Where did the universe come from? Do you believe in God? And the alien's like, no, we've advanced the technology and science. We don't need to believe in God. No one believes in God anymore. That's something in the museums that, our museums, those are relics of the Bible, Christianity, blah, blah, blah. He goes, well, then where did the universe come from if God didn't create it? And the alien says, well, we're just one universe out of infinite number of universes. We're just one in millions and millions of universes.
Yeah.
And then he keeps going. I thought to myself,
that didn't
time out,
answer
Mr.
anything.
Alien. Yeah, right. Time out, Mr. Alien. First of all, if you're so intellectual and you're from the future or wherever, you should take a 101 class in philosophy and logic because you didn't answer the question. Even if the universe is just one out of a million, it still does not answer the question of whether or not the universe began. And we know that it began. So even if you have this, quote, mother pregnant universe that's just popping baby universes every second, you're just pushing back the goalposts, like you said, because now you have to ask the question, okay, where did this multi-universe generator come from, and did it have a beginning? And if the law of entropy stands, which it does, then, hey, it's running out of energy, and if it's still going, then it had a beginning. Yeah. So appealing to the multiverse does nothing at all for the atheist.
I think it makes it worse.
And I believe it was John Lennox. Oh, absolutely. I believe it was John Lennox who said something to the extent of, so to get rid of the existence of one God, you have to posit an infinite number of other universes, millions and millions of other universes just to get rid of one God, which doesn't even do the job.
No, it doesn't do the job at all. Man, that's good stuff, man. This is something, and I'm pretty sure you've experienced this too, Eric, but I mean, you look at a telescope out into the universe, and it's so massive and huge and unknown. And then if you look in the microscope, it's just the same thing. Looking into a microscope is just as big as looking out into through a microscope out into the universe. And it's just so complex. I mean, the Bible says, we're wonderfully and beautifully made, and everybody likes to think of that in terms of cosmetics, like we look beautiful. And sure, you could take it that way, but I mean, when I read that passage, to me, it's just pointing to the intricacies and the beautiful design of the world and nature and cells and everything. I mean, it blows my mind, man. Just how complex this world is, and for someone to say, no, there is no God. It takes me for a whirlwind. It blows my mind because I could never fully go to atheism. And I did. I'm sure you have too. You've battled through doubts and you've had to work out these things. But I just could not come to grips looking at the world and say that there is no God. I couldn't go there.
Oh, absolutely. Declare the glory of God.
Excuse me? Yeah, you kind of broke up there.
I said, as the Word of God says, the creation, the heavens declare the glory of God. Is His handiwork.
Yeah. And this is another thing. Before we end today, Eric, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Greek philosophy. because, as Romans 1 says, that all of us could know God, his as we were talking about here, that his invisible attributes and his nature is clearly perceived, and I believe everybody could come to know God, that there is a God. And I find it fascinating just studying theology. I mean, not theology, excuse me, philosophy in the Greek sense, when you have Thales and Socrates and all these Greek philosophers. It's just interesting how these people were just through philosophy, we're coming to this conclusion of monism and pluralism, and that the universe has to be made out of one essence, and that's kind of how you get the earth, wind, and fire, and earth, and they had all these different ideas, but you had clearly, through the Greek philosophers, you could see how they were logically and reasoning their way to this one essence, although some of them didn't call God, but in essence what they were pointing to was God. And then you have also too in the Bible, as we've said, for the Jewish philosopher, they started with God, and so and right out of Genesis, that it doesn't even really make an argument, but it's saying, in the beginning was God, and just how, rather you're starting with God, or whether you're an unbeliever and you want to take another route into making an argument for the existence of God, you saw it in the Greek philosophers, and I kind of just wanted to get your thoughts on that as well, and just what you thought.
What's the question exactly?
Just the Greek philosophers, the Greek philosophers, just like Aristotle, Socrates, Thales, some of the early philosophers, how they were just through reason and logic and just examining the reality around them, they were coming to the conclusion of this. Of just concepts like monism, pluralism, and this concept of God in one essence, and how you could just, as Romans 1 says, you could it's clearly perceived. You could come to this conclusion. I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. So so as I said earlier, in my freshman courses of philosophy, I really had that fundamental belief that if all truth is grounded in God in one way or another, then, everything we come to know and learn about should in some way point back to God. And so I encourage atheists and Christians, please, by all means, read, learn, because everything you read and learn will not get you away from God. If anything, it'll point you towards God. Yeah. And of course, the atheists will have their arguments, but I'd say there's a lot of bad philosophy going on there. That's another topic for another time. But absolutely, when you just look and just begin to study, I strongly believe that within our being, we have this innate intuition of something going on. We know the famous, watchmaker argument. If you're walking along the beach and you see, a few rocks, you think nothing of it. But then if you see a watch, you think that there must have been some kind of design behind it. You look at archaeology. Archaeologists are digging all the time, and they find a few pointy rocks. They think nothing of it. And then they find a flint that's an arrow shape and think, there must have been some kind of a hunter around here. Now, how in the world do you deduce a hunter from a triangular pointed rock? Well, because there's a pattern. There's some type of ingenuity behind a simple pointed triangular rock. Well, if that's the case, when we look at everything in the universe, our DNA, for example, I find it ironic that within the SETI project, which is a search for extraterrestrial life, they do this by looking for specific patterns and information in any kind of signals, because they begin with the assumption that information comes from a mind, which is true. Yes. Well, if we look for information and we know that information comes from a mind, then I don't know why we're looking into our universe for information and intelligence when all we have to do is grab a microscope. And if you look at our DNA, it's crazy. We have 3.5 billion letters in a specific genetic sequence, which gives us the information for who we are, our physical bodies, our biological makeup. Yeah. Well, if a few signals from outer space tell us there's intelligent life, then what do 3.5 million letters in a genetic sequence tell us about where we come from? Obviously, a mind. Lennox gives a really interesting illustration. He says, suppose I'm with this a scientist who's an archaeologist, and we're looking through caves, and this Chinese archaeologist looks and sees these 2 scratches on a wall in paint and says, "Oh my gosh, somebody was here." And Lennox says, "Wait a minute, why?" Well, because these 2 scratches here are in a certain pattern or design, and these are the ancient characteristics or hieroglyphics for a human being, which means someone here, left their mark, if you will. And John Lennox says, "Okay, yeah, you're the scientist. Okay, sure." But then when they go back to the laboratory and they look at the DNA and they don't see 2 scratches, they see 3.5 billion letters in genetic sequence. They think, "Oh, random chance, evolution."
Yeah.
And how is it that you look at arrowheads and cave scratchings and you think intelligence? You look at our DNA and you think atheism. There is no God.
Yeah, I don't get that. I don't. Again, it goes back kind of to the multi-universe theory. I think it makes your argument harder. They'll see like, "See, look at the DNA. See, there is no God." I'm like, what? I don't see how that points. Again, it goes back to it makes the argument, their belief harder to justify.
Oh, absolutely.
Is there anything else, Eric, you want to say? We already went a little bit past an hour, and I wanted just to point listeners to where they could find you at, and also your ministry and what you do, and also point people maybe around a ballpark range of when your book might be released.
You can find me on Facebook, Eric Hernandez Ministries, YouTube, also Eric Hernandez Ministries. We have a website, erichernandezministries.com. The reason it's that title is because I'm not very creative. A friend of mine years ago was working on the website, said, "What's the name?" I said, "I have no idea." He goes, "Eric Hernandez Ministries?" I said, "Sure, why not?"
Awesome.
So yeah, you can find me there. Any of those, I have a number of debates and even classes on my YouTube channel.
Nice.
One of my most recent was a debate on abortion. I debated a feminist lawyer who is the executive director of a nationwide abortion organization, and it went great.
Yes.
It was incredible. People after I had young ladies afterwards come and tell me that as a result of this event, they had changed their position on abortion and were now pro-life, which was my goal, to save future unborn children. As far as the book, like I said earlier, keep me in your prayers. I'm in the process of writing. I've got a few more chapters to finish, and then I want to go back and just kind of polish up a few things and have some other eyes, kind of look at it. But I'm hoping, fingers crossed, God willing, praying, within the next year or so, to have it done. Like I said, God willing. Some of you know, in Houston we had Harvey happen, and that kind of threw off a lot of things. I have a 6-month-old newborn here at the house, and that was such a blessing, unexpected, but such a blessing. I mean, that's a whole testimony itself. And about a couple years ago, we had just moved and got a house. So lots of things have been happening, but at the same time, I see God's hand in all of it. God has also expanded my platform through connections like yourself. Not too long ago, I was on William Lane Craig's podcast, Reasonable Faith.
You were.
So little things like that, God has been just kind of expanding my networking and connections, and makes sense why the book has been delayed a little bit. But whatever God has in store, I'm down for it. Yeah. I know when it comes out, it's going to be great, man. I'm going to buy it, and we're going to have some on the shelf here. Amen.
Guarantee it. All right, guys. So that's going to go ahead and wrap up this podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Like and share with your atheist friends. Shoot Eric Hernandez a email on his website. Contact him if you have any questions. And we'll be back on the next one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And we will see you on the next podcast. Thank you.